I'm Scott. I've been developing in Rails for over 10 years. It's probably like closer to 15 now. I've been an occasional contributor to RuboCop. Spoiler, that's what I'm going to be talking about. And I have various online presence, some of which talk about code, most of which just talk about musicals and silly movies. I've worked at a variety of places, some of which you might have heard of, some of which you probably won't have done. My current workplace is a company called Spyscape, and we have an interactive spy museum in New York, which due to current circumstances is currently closed, but we do have a website which is a mixture of Rails and lots of other bits and pieces. Embarking a huge new online piece of work that will be completely Rails, which is nice. But we're all the places that I've worked, I've basically trying to be an advocate for cleanly written code, and even in legacy code bases, and actually especially in legacy code bases. And that can be tricky because we're always dealing with that sort of code that was written by the developer before you, and it takes longer working out what's going on than it does to actually change it. And so that's why I like this quote by Harold Abison. Programs must be written for people to read and only incidentally for machines to execute. If we prioritize ourselves and other developers as we write code, it just helps everything. I actually used that quote before, which is online. I'm going to put all these, give you a link to all these slides later on, and all these links are clickable, so don't worry about taking notes or anything. But today I want to talk about the class of tools that help us write that readable code. And it's like, strictly speaking, code formatting and linting are slightly different things. Code formatting is more about just like rearranging the text to make it easier to read and understand. And linting is more about actually looking at what that code does and how it does it. But generally there's like no hard line between the two, and across all sorts of languages, you tend to use one application to help with both tasks. So code linting is actually a pretty good thing all around. It helps you catch common errors that you might make. It helps you to encourage consistency between teams, and helps you write easy to read code. But it also helps keep that code easy to read. And that just makes all our projects that little bit easier to maintain. Because consistency and readability are the absolute keys to maintainable code. Now, there are linters for all sorts of languages. Pretty much every language, modern language, has some form of linter. And obviously for Ruby, there is the big one, which is RuboCop. Now, there is a big difference with RuboCop to all those others, and that is basically I have seen more resistance from Ruby developers to actually using RuboCop well than I've seen for any other developers using any other language. You can see this if you just search GitHub for some of the open source Git commit messages that start off sort of like going along with what RuboCop suggests, and then sort of like starting to get a little bit passive aggressive, and then it stops being passive aggressive and just goes out all aggression until sort of like someone takes the nuclear option. This isn't normal. So one of the things I ask myself is just like, why is this the case? It could be that because some languages have clearly defined coding standards. If you've worked in PHP, you might have heard of PSR2. Go has a tool, Go format, that actually reformats your code according to a very strict set of rules, but Go's quite small, so it can get away with that. JavaScript, obviously a very big language. These days, you tend to have a collection of recommended style guides. And if you start using React, there's a whole set of React recommended ones and so on. Swift have tried and failed and had one of the most acrimonious disputes I've ever seen on a computing mailing list, which is fun to read unless you're actually part of it. But Ruby doesn't have a uniformly agreed coding style. And there have been some efforts over the years to try and get all the things that we do into a consistent manner. So to discuss whether you should use single quotes versus double quotes, parentheses around arguments, and so on. And so these 3 style guides that initially were available just as effectively as markdown documents in a GitHub repo, now actually like really nicely laid out and structured, and covering just basic Ruby plus also Rails and RSpec. And those guides were the basis for the defaults in RuboCop. But there are also other attempts. Standard is one, which is actually a gem that just includes a RuboCop config file with a separate set of rules. And that is actually quite a good indicator that if we don't agree with RuboCop rules, there's usually a configuration that matches our preferred style. So if as a team of developers, we agree on a particular way of working, RuboCop usually has something which will help us stick to that way of working. So that's like, all of those things don't necessarily indicate why there's been so much resistance to RuboCop. And I have actually wondered, like, is it because it's a resistance to the authoritarianism? I could say that word properly in rehearsals. But looking at this logo, RuboCop is like, it is quite stronger than a lot of other language linters. And of course, we know that it's basically a pun on RoboCop. And if you're sitting at home for whatever reason over the next few weeks and have something to do, I really do recommend seeking out the original 1987 film. It's on Netflix. Do not watch RoboCop 2 or 3 or any of the remakes or the animated series or anything like that. Just this one, and just forget about the rest. That's fine. But generally, it's like, does that image have a problem? Maybe if we had a friendlier robot as part of the logo, would that really help? I'm not sure it would. I think the problem actually is that we are actively encouraged in the installation documents and the readmes to use RuboCop in a way that limits its effective use and actually stops us from working well. For example, this is a repo that I started working on that had been in place for 4 years before I started working on it. About a year before I joined, someone had added RuboCop to the file, but wasn't really doing anything with it, to the project rather. And if I rolled back our repo to the point it was installed and run RuboCop on at that point, you could see every single file in the application was reporting some form of RuboCop violation. Now, if you do what the installation documents and all the guides suggest, you can run Autogen config, which will generate a configuration file for you. You do that and run it again, and suddenly everything's green. And it's like, this is great. It's like, hey, brilliant. And so what I've seen people do is actually then take that green state and actually make that a CI dependency and say, right, we've got to keep it green. And that means we're only going to, like, as long as everything's green, we only ever release good code. That's wrong. And so instead of having a cop, you end up with ED209, which, if anybody who's seen RoboCop knows, was an alternative law enforcement machine. Unfortunately, everything went horribly wrong. And the reason it does is it generates this file called RuboCop to do YAML, and then basically inserts it to the beginning of your own config file and basically says, use all these instructions. Now, looking at the to-do file that repo that I showed you created, it is long. It is like, there is a lot of exclusions. Any cop where more than 15 files violate it, it actually turns off that cop. So it never gets, your code never gets tested against those cops again. And when you get down to the metrics, it will just choose the largest numbers possible so that everything works. So it means you can have block lengths of 852 lines. You can have methods that are 518 lines long. And all of these rules then get applied to everything in your code base. And so by using Autogen config, we set our style guide to be only as good as the mess we've already got. And what we actually want is RuboCop, the main YAML file, to be our definitive style guide, a definitive statement of how we want all our future code to be styled. And that's code that we're writing brand new or code that we're rewriting. And so this is the #1 rule I would impose upon everybody. Don't ever include that to-do file in your RuboCop file. And that does mean that when you run RuboCop, it's like you won't be at 100% green, particularly if you're working on a code base like that where the project was 4 or 5 years old. But I think that is okay. I think you should not panic about everything not being green. What it actually is telling us is how much of our code doesn't meet our standards yet. And I think that's more important than just like creating a mess of green that just hides everything away under the carpet. But you can actually use that Autogen config file, the to-do file, and make something that's a little bit more useful. The first thing is you can stop it from turning off all those cops and disabling them by giving it an exclude limit to say, like, only turn them off if you hit 2,000 files that violate it. Now, or you can basically pick any number that is larger than the number of Ruby files in your project. You can also stop it calculating those maximum values using the not entirely intuitive Autogen only exclude. What it's basically saying is only actually list files as files to exclude from the cop. And the third, of course, is actually just whenever you run Autogen config, it automatically injects itself into RuboCop YAML. So you can just use git restore to reverse that out. And what that actually leaves us, the next thing is that helps us keep our config file as straightforward as possible. And then we can say from there, any lines of code we add or edit should meet the rules as defined in the YAML file. But it's still useful to have that to-do file, which is basically becomes then a list of all the places where your old code doesn't quite meet. And every time you rerun Autogen config, as long as you reverse out using git restore and remove that insertion, the to-do file basically becomes a list of files that don't meet your personal configuration. So if you change a cop in your standard config file, the list of files in your to-do file will reflect that. And so you end up with 2 files checked into the source code that have very different intentions. The first one is a definitive statement of how we want codes to look. And the second one is a list of files that don't meet that yet. But the problem comes, of course, it's like, if we're saying that we only want to look at changes on new code or edited code, what happens when you make a small change to a really large file? And again, going back to this code base, it was actually quite nice to work on. I'm not just picking on it, but we had this file. This is a mini map of the file itself. And it was actually 458 lines long. And within there, RuboCop would report 226 individual violations. So what would happen if, like, how would we clean this up? Now, one of my colleagues did attempt to create a pull request using autocorrects that RuboCop provides. And it can actually fix a lot of your issues. It can't fix everything. And here you can see sort of like it actually changed just over 120 lines. I think the fact that it's adding more lines than it's deleting is because it was able to work out how to reformat some things to get everything looking nicely. But the trouble with autocorrect is that it can introduce side effects. Not all the cops are absolutely 100% reliable. There is a safe autocorrect, which is supposed to only apply autocorrect from cops that are trusted. But even then, it's still not 100%. And it's like with every release of RuboCop, you'll get cops that used to be thought safe that aren't. And also, it introduces a lot of churn in our code, and that's something that we may want to avoid. Because that churn makes it harder to spot like the actual changes that we're making. And so when it comes to pull request and code review, that can be a nightmare. And in future, when we're coming back and wanting to see why a file has changed at a particular time, it can actually be a lot harder to see what the real change was and what was just a linter induced change. And some things you can do to alleviate that, to keep commits separate. So you can have the changes of code that we're actually interested in one commit, and the RuboCop or linter induced changes in a separate commit. I would even suggest it might be worth actually thinking about, should you actually do those in separate pull requests? But even so, it can actually be really hard to actually see and validate those changes. Because RuboCop doesn't support only looking at sections of files. So we need to find another way to effectively ignore messages coming from lines that we haven't personally changed. And one way is using an IDE that has RuboCop support built in. This is a screen grab from RubyMine, but you can get plugins for pretty much every development environment these days. And so when you're writing code yourself, you can actually see when RuboCop is actually going to signal something on lines of code that you're writing or changing. But that's very much a manual process, but it still is a useful one. We can also take advantage of the fact that all our repos are in source code control, and Git knows which lines have changed and which haven't. And there are several tools that piggyback onto that. One is Pronto. I don't know if anybody's used it before, but you have a core Pronto gem, and then you can install runners for multiple different linters, not just Ruby ones. So RuboCop, Brakeman, which is less of a linter and more of a security alert system, Haml, SAS, ESLint, all have Pronto runners. And you can point Pronto either towards changes locally that haven't been staged yet, or it can do a diff against particular commits on or on particular branches. And it basically, you basically just call Pronto run, and it will just give you a list of all the violations on files that are on lines that are affected by your commit. So that's really one really useful way. My personal preference is to use overcommit, which is a system of allowing you to define multiple Git hooks using a YAML file. You can define pre-commit hooks and post-commit hooks, basically like anywhere where you could actually write your own Git hook. And if any of the pre-commit hooks fail, you just can't actually commit. It's got built-in support for RuboCop or Pronto, and lots and lots of others as well. And then you've also got, you can even like use it to like check that you're writing your Git messages in the right format and so on. This is an example here. This is a case where one of my YAML files has changed, so it's run YAML lint on that. It's run trailing whitespace checks on all files, so not just Ruby files. It's also looking to see whether there are any to-do or fix me comments littered around the code. This is actually also producing a warning that this particular gem file, the bundle had changed and there was a security vulnerability. And then right at the bottom, you can see 3 RuboCop errors on modified lines, and it actually fails and actually refuses to accept the commit locally. So it gives you basically a barrier and saying fix these now as you're just making the commit, and then once everything passes, as soon as if you push it to the upstream repo, you're going to be pushing nice clean code. And that helps us with this the good scout principle of always leaving the campground cleaner than you found it. And going back to this repo, obviously this is the state it was when RuboCop was installed but not really used. And within a year, it had actually started to get a lot cleaner. Obviously, it had grown quite a bit. There's actually an extra 500 files in here, but it's you can start to see it's definitely a much better coherent and adhesion to our good principles of writing code. And I think, just to reiterate, really, restyling code that you're not touching for any other reason should always be handled with care, not just because you can introduce errors, particularly with autocorrect, that you hadn't really intended. I like to think of rewriting code like that as a form of refactoring. And if you've got a code base that is messy, but delivering a production code base that is delivering value to users, that is actually probably more important. So it's in all the times where you're actually thinking about how do you juggle tech debt versus building new stuff, getting your code base nice and clean is a part of that tech debt. Still, using the famous Kent Beck quote for anytime you want to make a change, make the change easy and then make the easy change. I think actually there is an argument to say restyling your code as a means to making those changes easier is a worthwhile task in itself. We've done that on a few projects where we've actually taken the time to actually just restyle some dirty code, which generates a general refactor, and then that helps us see exactly what we need to make the change. Slight pivot, but actually talking about those metrics cops in particular, obviously you saw in that to-do file, it was generating huge numbers. Has some maximums for various things within RuboCop's default config. So you can see there, classes shouldn't be any more than 100 lines. It's parameter list should only be 5 parameters, blocks should only be 25 lines, and so on. It also has some defaults for complexity. And it's these limits are tough. It's actually trying to work within them is not the easiest thing to do, but sometimes sometimes feel that they are actually quite fair. I've seen nearly every developer team I've ever worked with has ended up adjusting some of them, which is also fair. But I do think that actually trying to work within those constraints can actually make for better code, because it encourages us to split larger methods maybe into smaller, meaningful ones. If we've got huge, long text strings, which is pushing that line length out, maybe we should be using locale files and using just identifiers in code. And also asking ourselves the questions is this particular class doing too much? And I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Sandy Metz's rules for developers, but they cover the very similar ground. So first rule is saying classes can be no longer than 100 lines of code. Methods can be no longer than 5 lines of code and pass no more than 4 parameters into a method. And controllers can instantiate only one object. Now, if you compare Sandy's rules to RuboCop's, you can actually see that actually RuboCop's aren't quite as severe as Sandy's. But I think having limits is actually a really good thing. And she does introduce this, which is called the zeroth rule, of you can break these rules only if you have a good reason or your pair lets you, which is fair enough, I suppose. And then you can actually see more on those principles on that link, Thoughtbot of tried working tightly to those and then incorporated them into their best practices in terms of also how you actually decide not to use them. So similarly with RuboCop, if you try and fit within the guidelines wherever possible, what happens if you can't? We should probably consider limiting the scope of any relaxation of the rules rather than switching them off altogether. And for example, so the default block length is 25 lines. So imagine that we've actually specified that in our config file. Now, if you get to something like the migration files in the DB folder, sometimes it's like those blocks, you do actually need them to be quite long, particularly if you're defining like models that have lots of arguments, lots of columns. Rather than actually disabling it for the whole repo, what you can do is add a config file into that folder and override the block length just for that folder. As long as you inherit from the parent one in the project root, all your other rules will be applied the same. And you can actually go further as well. Sometimes what I tend to do in RSpec is I don't mind at all how long an it clause is. If it's a clear test, I'd much rather have that than one that sacrifices clarity for the sake of brevity. So we actually exclude it from being counted as within the block length cop. But if you've got any support or helper methods within that spec folder, they will still actually be examined by RuboCop. Now, if anybody's used RuboCop for a while, it's like you often see something where people are manually disabling RuboCop from working on a particular file or a particular line or a particular method. And it can be useful to turn off your general rule just for a particular situation. But it does have to be used with care. Actually, there's in the version of RuboCop that was just released last week, they've actually now got a new RuboCop that checks to see that you're not just other cops, which is good fun. But what you can also do, so I think the thing that I've found is that people tend to disable a rule and then just leave it. Instead of using disable, you can actually use to do, which at least gives an indication to people that it's actually something that is worth coming back to and thinking it again. You know, when you come back sort of like 3 months later and you've had quite a few changes of context, sometimes you can see a way to tidy up code that just wasn't visible to you at the time. To limit the scope of changes if possible, and even changing a cop setting so that you're disabling entirely. So if you actually look at the cop definitions in the docs, there's often quite a lot of configuration you can actually do, and that you might find that it's easier to find a version of the rule that you are much more comfortable working with rather than disabling it altogether. But the other thing I would say is stop RuboCop analyzing code that you have no control over. The big one is schema.rb. Anytime you run a migration, that file will get regenerated, even if the migration resulted in no changes to the database. And so even if you can format that as much as you like to fit in within your existing styles, but it's only going to get rewritten anyway. So I would just exclude that totally from your RuboCop setup. You might also think, and if you're writing if you've got any bin stubs that Bundler has generated for you, sometimes it's worth thinking about, do I actually want to exclude those as well? It all comes down to a question of who do you consider the owner of that. If you rewrite your bin stubs to suit your personal style, you take ownership of that and just make sure that you don't overwrite them. And coming back to rule 0, it's like we should break the rules only if you have a good reason or your pair lets you. Just always remember that we set the rules. RuboCop is a pairing partner, but we are the ones in control. And that way, RuboCop can be a genuine partner, and it's a bit less of a gatekeeper. And then you might remember that under that austere helmet, there was a person underneath. It's a lot less threatening. And that's me. Thank you very much. And that is a link so you can get a PDF of all those slides.